Please be seated. I want you to go ahead and turn to Acts chapter 18. Acts chapter 18, and we'll pick up there in just a moment. I want to spend some time this evening with us since we're getting on the week where the revival in America is here. You know, we've altered our services. We came an hour early so we can be a part of a gospel meeting effort, and we're going to do that Wednesday night too. You know, we're moving to Thursday, and it's apparent to us that this is important, isn't it? I think we all in this room would agree that studying the Scriptures, the preaching of the Scriptures is very important. So for just a few moments of our time, I want us to look at this subject, and I want us to look at it through the eyes of the Apostle Paul. And we're going to look at two different passages. Number one, we're going to go to Acts 18, but we're also going to think about 1 Corinthians chapter 9, verse 16, in that particular scene where Paul talks about how he must be a person that preaches the gospel. And at the very end of that passage, it says, "For woe is unto me if I preach not the gospel." Isn't that interesting? Paul thought it was a tragedy. Paul thought it was sinful. Paul thought problems should come upon him if he did not fulfill his responsibilities. You see, if you'll read that entire section of chapter 9 down to the end of the chapter from verse 16, you'll find that Paul felt very strongly about the preaching of the gospel. So let's ask a question, just a simple question, and we're going to give a number of answers to it tonight. Why should we support the preaching of the gospel? Why should we support the preaching of the gospel? Go with me to Acts 18, and this is where we're going to get our answer. And we're going to find a number of answers as we go through our lesson this evening that will help us understand why you and I should want to support the preaching of the gospel. Number one, in Acts 18, verses 1 through 3, we should want to support the gospel, the preaching of the gospel, because it builds relationships. This is what happens in Acts 18. Pick up in verse 1. "After these things, Paul departed from Athens and came to Corinth." Verse 2, "And found a certain Jew named Aquila, born in Pontus, lately come from Italy, with his wife Priscilla, because that Claudius had commanded all Jews to depart from Rome, and came unto them. And because he was of the same craft, he abode with them and wrought, for by their occupation they were tent makers." I want you to see as this particular scene opens up, you have Paul who's traveling throughout the known world of that time. Matter of fact, I want you to think about this for just a moment. It was Paul who has just in Acts chapter 17 stood at Mars Hill and said before those people that were there, which, by the way, would have not been a small gathering, just 1, 2, or 3. It would have been a larger number of people. And he had just told these men in Acts 17 at Mars Hill that he perceives that they are too superstitious. He says, "I perceive you're too religious." And he goes on to declare unto them the unknown God of whom they had an inscription with an altar, just in case they missed him. And he goes on to give that illustration. And then we find him in Corinth. He finds these people. They were tent makers, as Paul was a tent maker by craft. And he abode with them, and they were making tents together. I want you to see something about this. As Paul went throughout the known world of the time, he built relationships. Think about your life for just a minute. How many people have you met who have preached the gospel? Or how many people have you met in connection with the preaching of the gospel? Think about the men who have come in for the lectureship. Think about the relationships you've built there. Think about the individuals who have come for a gospel meeting and the relationships that were built therein. Think about things like we're going to do this evening and Monday and Tuesday and Wednesday, Revival in America. And think about the relationships that will be built that center around the preaching of the gospel. Number one, I want you to see this. This is not because it's more important. It's just how the text flows here in Acts 18. The preaching of the gospel builds relationship. Here's why. Because there is unity in the gospel. Why should we support it? Because of relationships. Why should we support the preaching of the gospel? Well, there's a purpose there. It's verse 4, Acts 18, verse 4. "And he reasoned in the synagogues every Sabbath and persuaded Jews and Greeks." It was Paul's mission. Matter of fact, that's why you see him go on a number of journeys, 3 major journeys of which he took throughout the known world. It was Paul's mission, it was Paul's purpose to preach the gospel. Thus is why we illustrated the passage, 1 Corinthians 9:16. If he did not do so, he saw it as a woe that was upon him, for it was a great responsibility. So number 1, why do we support the gospel? Because of relationships. But number 2, in our text, because of the purpose. What is the purpose of preaching the gospel? It's twofold. Number 1, we see it here in verse 4. He reasoned in the synagogue every Sabbath and persuaded the Jews and the Greeks. Here's purpose number 1 of preaching the gospel: to reason and persuade. To reason and persuade. Now, we're going to take point number 1, the lost. There's no doubt that you and I believe that the gospel should be presented to the lost. Isn't that true? There are those, as we have sung in songs even today, this morning and this evening, there are those who are lost. In our prayer as we began this evening, our opening prayer, it was prayed that those that are lost may hear the gospel. What's the purpose of preaching the gospel for those that are lost? To reason with them and to persuade them. Number 2, what's the purpose of preaching the gospel? Well, the purpose of preaching the gospel is for you and me, isn't it? As Christians, is there a value in the preaching the gospel? I'd say yes. And I would say the same thing about those that are lost in verse 4. It is to reason and to persuade even us. You ever read a passage, studied a passage, heard someone preach a passage and realized, I need to do better on that? That's the purpose of presenting the gospel. It helps us understand how we can continually mold our lives after the name that we bear. We bear the name Christian, a Christ-like person. So why do we support the preaching of the gospel? It's because there is a purpose. Why do we support the preaching of the gospel? It's because of co-workers. It's verse 5. And when Silas and Timothy were come from Macedonia, Paul was pressed in the Spirit and testified to the Jews that Jesus was Christ. Oh, here's Paul. You see this over and over in the work and life of Paul. In the trips of Paul, you see his co-workers. He often, and many times in the King James Version, you'll see them talked about as co-laborers. He had people that he really enjoyed being around. He had people that really enjoyed doing the same thing that he would do, and he was someone who had co-workers. You know, when you think about this, I want you to think about something. When you go door knocking, now it's been a while since we've done that, and one day we'll get back to that, but isn't it much, much better when you go with somebody else? You see, it's certainly possible that you can do it by yourself. There's nothing wrong with that. But when you have someone by your side, isn't it so much better? You know why it's better? Because you have something in common. You have a goal in common. You have a labor in common. You have a work in common. And by the way, I'll tell you this. When audiences participate by turning those pages, by looking into those Bibles, you during a sermon are a co-laborer with the preacher. There's a lot going on there, isn't there? Someone was asking me recently if preachers could tell when people aren't paying attention. We can. Most of the time, sometimes. But it's so much better when we have co-laborers together in this idea. So you see the idea of workers. It's why we support the preaching of the gospel. Look at verses 6 and 7. We support the gospel because of renewal. Verse 6, and when they opposed themselves and blasphemed, he shook his raiment. Pause. And when they opposed themselves, this is the Jews and the Greeks that are being described in this particular scene. When they opposed themselves and blasphemed, he shook his raiment and said to them, your blood be upon your own heads. I am clean from henceforth. I will go unto the Gentiles. Verse 7. And he departed thence and entered into a certain man's house named Justus, one who that worshiped God and whose house joined hard to the synagogue. It's renewal. It's why we support the preaching of the gospel. Now, in this particular occasion, Paul's presentation of the message was rejected. That's difficult. That's very difficult. But look at what happened. As soon as one door is closed, another door is open. That's how it always works. That's how it has always worked, and that's how it's working here. He sees a group of people. He spends time with them. He testifies, verse 5, that Jesus was Christ, and they turn from that message. So Paul goes on and renews himself to someone else that will listen, and he goes and they worshiped God, and he joined them hard-pressed in that idea. There's always renewal when the preaching of the gospel is taking place. Number two, there's renewal in this way. Not only is it renewal when we are together as like-minded people, but there is renewal in having a confidence in knowing I'm following God. That's a great renewal. So you see verses 6 and 7, a renewal. I want you to see verse 8 in Acts chapter 18. You see an obedience that takes place. It's verse 8, in Crispus, the chief ruler of the synagogue, believed on the Lord with all his house, and many of the Corinthians, hearing, believed and were baptized. Matter of fact, that's the primary objective of the gospel being preached. Remember verse 4, that purpose: to reason, to persuade, and wait for people to obey. Here's something we need to understand, and we learned it from Acts 18. We learned it in this idea of obedience. You and I, we will never make anyone do what they do not want to do. You know, that's a principle we learn early in life. You learned this with your children, didn't you? When you told your child to do something, if they didn't want to do it, could you make them do it? Now, you certainly could encourage them with the Board of Education, and they might get on that. But you're never going to make someone do something that they do not want to do. We see this in our work lives. Other employees that we may work with who may not want to do a task, if they don't want to, they probably will not. Matter of fact, many times they'll find ways to get creative about not doing what they've been asked to do. And here we learn that. These earlier, they did not want to follow the gospel that had to do with Jesus who was Christ. These in verse 7 here, or verse 8, verse 8. They had something to do with the gospel of Christ. And many people in Corinth, think about that, not just one, but many. Many of the Corinthians, they heard, they believed, and they were baptized. That's obedience, folks. Obedience comes from hearing and then acting, following on what you have heard. And that was what Paul was doing. So why do we support the preaching of the gospel? We do so for obedience. But I want you to see one more thing that happens here in Acts 18 that helps us understand why we support the preaching of the gospel. We support the preaching of the gospel because of example. Look at the life of, and let me change a word here, look at the life of Saul. Now look at the life of Paul. Is there not an example there that you and I can understand? Is there not something there that we can take and learn? After living how he wanted to, even though he said, I was very zealous. After living how he wanted to, after living how others encouraged him to, he found out that he was the one that persecuted the church instead of being the one who followed the Savior. Now he's preaching Christ and that Jesus was the Christ. Paul was the example. We see many examples inside of Scripture, and we follow the Scriptures in the preaching of the gospel because the examples that stand before us. So why do we support the gospel? Well, I think those reasons that we just listed, the idea of relationships, the idea of having a purpose, of having co-workers, of finding renewal, of having obedience, and seeing the examples that exist, show us why we preach the gospel. And thus we think back to 1 Corinthians chapter 9, verse 16, where Paul says, For though I preach the gospel, I have nothing to glory of. For necessity is laid upon me, yea, woe is unto me, if I preach not the gospel. You see, it's Romans 10, verse 17, and really the entire chapter of Romans 10 that helps us understand that the power is inside of the gospel. And that's what should be preached, and that's what should be supported as we are people who are entrusted to preach the gospel. I know tonight's a little different service for it. It's abbreviated service. It's a different timed service. We're going to go to another service. But here's what's true. I know from time to time, every person that's alive lives in sin. Maybe tonight as a Christian, that's you. Maybe there's something in your life that needs to be made right. You'll have to make that decision, but do know that God forgives His people. And that can be done tonight. Maybe you're here tonight and you need to become a Christian. Well, what a great opportunity it would be. As we think about this week of gospel messages, preaching of the gospel, what a great time to encourage and build and strengthen yourself as you seek to build your faith inside of the Scriptures. What will it be for you tonight? Do you need to come forward tonight and make your life right? Do you need to come forward and be baptized?